This week, for a meander through the extensive National Park System network, I thought it would be fun to wander back into crowded urban spaces, something a little more accessible than the edges of early 19th century civilization, and occasionally, even the edges now. Since we're still mucking about in glass and preservation and the rapidly changing world of the 19th century, let's go to the National Historic Site of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is centered around the Vassall Craigie Longfellow House. It began life as a Georgian construction and stately family home in 1759. Back to pre-America. That would house over 200 years of people. The first two families to inhabit the structure are less famous, except for the fact that it was used as an early headquarters of the Continental Army, and yes, George Washington slept there for about 9 months. The Longfellow family, of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow fame, spent significantly more time there. But what ties this imposing Cambridge residence to our current interest in glass and preserving food and this and that and future interests in time is an hourglass. By family legend, filled with sand from the Sahara. Making hourglasses or sand glasses was a well-established trade and, frankly, soon to be a dying one as we enter the 19th century. Hourglasses were an important part of the navigation that made colonization and trade between Europe and America possible. Sand glasses became more available to regular people as the sand glass trade expanded in the new U.S., and carrying home a bit of sand from the Sahara to make an hourglass is a perfect example of the kind of souvenir a person would acquire as part of the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour in the 19th century was the preferred and even expected activity of wealthy young men and a few adventurous young women after they had finished their formal schooling, but before they took up the full responsibilities of the family interests, marriage, and managing the family legacy. The historical Longfellow hourglass would rapidly transform from a useful timekeeper to a quaint curiosity as the mechanical age brought in more clocks, then watches, and then trains that made the use of dependable timekeeping rather than approximate and local essential. And before we know it, our lives are run by clocks, not by the rise and set of the sun. The other fun thing about this house is that it has better than average acknowledgement of the women connected with the house, both the Longfellow women who ran it and the staff that did the work. In much of history, houses or castles or whatnot are often depicted as places men visit as they're doing things of historical import. But if this podcast has shown me nothing else, without people, mainly women, running these homes and turning out food with astonishing dependability, making these houses into places that are alive, none of the other history stuff gets done. So hop the T, the MBTA trains in the greater Boston area, and go visit the Longfellow House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to see some of the rich and complex past of both the house and the layers of history built up by 200 years of occupation. And see if you can spy that hourglass in Longfellow's library. Episode 119. More radical changes to 19th century food storage, mason jars, and all that. Welcome to the history of American food. It is American food storage in glass at last, and all the manufacturing that made that possible. It's the materials, sure, but it also depends on an entire lack of child labor protections in concert with the growth of mechanized food processing and the emergence of the engine-driven American transportation network on land and on sea. To hear about this sprawling saga that ends up in several seasons from now with fresh strawberries and Christmas recipes, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that without plate glass, the 19th century factory would not have been possible, at least not on the scale that it was built out to before there were electric lights. Using electricity to light up buildings doesn't even start to happen until the 1890s. Before that, if you wanted light indoors, you needed a hole for the light to come through, which meant that everything else would come in too. We are a pretty long way from the wire tech that makes window screens possible. Or you needed to burn something for light. Sure, there was some window glass, but it was expensive and not suitable for filling in large spaces in large buildings. You had to cut the pieces of glass and then make little wood or lead cages for the little glass pieces to sit in. Monstrously expensive stained glass windows aside, the diamond pane windows, the 4 and 9 and 12 and so on pane windows you see in old houses or houses cosplaying it being old were just too expensive to use to fill large window spaces in things like factories. But the things that changed all that were developments in the glass game that allowed large single pieces of glass to be rectangular and clear. And this was a big change from the spinning pizza dough method of making a flat piece of glass. The speed and slumping problems of the disc of glass realistically limited its size. And for anyone who's tried to use the spinning method to expand a sheet of dough, it takes skill and strength. And even then, it's going to be a bit wonky. Dough is cooperatively plastic. Glass is tougher to work with. It's hot and solidifies often faster than you want it to. And the only way to make it plastic again is to get it so hot that it slumps and then all of that spreading out is lost. Big sigh. Enter the cylinder method. I mentioned it back in the glass episode and said that blowing a cylinder, then cutting it open and flattening it out made larger panes of glass, yes, but they were all bubbly and scratched and generally not useful for seeing through at all. Well, 50 years or so of fiddling with sand and mineral mixtures, better liquid glass holding furnaces, annealing ovens, improved polishing methods, and wet leather, of all things. Clear glass from these cut cylinders was made generally accessible starting in 1839. Suddenly, larger, clear pieces of glass at economical scale were available. Previously, the amount of grinding and polishing needed to make the glass clear made the sheets so expensive they were used in showy applications like silvered mirrors or parts of fancy carriages. I mean, glass windows, especially large single-pane glass windows, were so rare that they were used as a flex to be displayed in rich people coaches. British Royal Treasury money was being used to purchase such a thing in the early 20th century. The British Royal State Glass Coach used to bring Princess Diana to her wedding was built in 1881 and purchased for George V's coronation in 1911. As a comparison, look up the 2008 Nissan Cube and its crazy wraparound rear window. But someone looking to build a factory where the outside could be largely kept out and the inside could largely be kept in, these new pieces of glass were changing the game. They also made it possible to put windows up high in the walls and let in light, the clerestory window. Even new roof designs were created, especially that sawtooth shape with skylights facing south and west, which allowed light deep into a large factory room. This was designed and first used in 1827. The availability of glass windows made the 19th century large enclosed factory, frankly, possible. And one of the things made in these large factories were, back to iron, the increasingly clever metal molds bottles could be blown into. So even though blowing glass into molds had been developed and brought to a pretty high art by the Roman and especially Venetian glassmakers, with the unwinding of the Roman Empire and the loss of lots of technical knowledge, it meant no more mold blowing for a while. Also, when the Romans were creating mold-blown glass, it was usually as expensive art objects. The molds were meticulously, individually crafted for looks, not for practical use, and were likely single-use items. As glassmaking was reestablished in Europe, objects were shaped by a team at the end of a pole, either pulled and shaped with metal tools or as a blob of glass inflated using a metal pipe by a glassblower with impressive breath control. And again, with a team with metal tools to shape the object. But these items took skill and time and large amounts of individual talent and judgment to shape. Yes, getting to liquid glass was lots of work, sand, mineral mixtures, and all that fuel, but then the individual shaping of objects was also tiring and time-consuming. But as metal manufacture improved, more materials were available, and the mechanization of some of the hardest parts of making iron and then other alloys were turned over to hammers run by water wheels rather than human brawn alone. So now people had the time to start to tinker with making more clever things out of metal rather than spending most of the effort simply making the metals. As we saw last week, rolling metal into thin and then ever thinner sheets was a big innovation, and we got the metal that could be made into cans. First laboriously by hand, but soon the major steps of cutting and bending were also done by machine. Certainly somewhere there's an insulting quote by Bender from Futurama that could be inserted here. The final soldering closure would continue to be done by hand for quite a while yet, but the can had arrived for many people some of the time by the 1840s. It was no longer just weird food for rich people only. And once standards for manufacturing that included measuring the time and temperature for the purpose of not getting customers killed were generally in place, the market for canned food expanded, and it would change provisioning the military forever. While foraging would never end, the idea that an army was like a plague of locusts would. And there would be an advantage to being a supplied army versus a foraging army. And it's going to have consequences right in America very soon. For with the can, armies no longer have to view the surrounding land as the source of most of their food. How they will travel and where they have to put their effort to do war will forever alter how wars are planned and conducted. Canned food would also supply other travels for the purposes of exploration, establishing colonies, plantations, farms, and other economic outposts, and religious missionaries, altering the logistics for those ventures and their global reach as well. But this early 19th century canned food was still expensive, and it required the use of a factory. It was only worth doing at all when one had a large amount of beef or dehydrated vegetables or butter or peas or the like, all at once. So the next question for the individual property owner or small village was, how could the wonders of this canned food thingy be brought home? How could the glut of peaches or green beans or fall quail or ham hocks or beets or apples or whatever be preserved in a way that no longer requires hours of laborious dehydration or all that lifting and hauling and climbing inside of barrels and time with all that salt? So this is when and how the possibility and idea of home canning was born. Cans required a factory, but the combination of larger iron pots with flat bottoms that could be used on these new iron stoves and these new, more widely available, far less expensive, sturdy glass jars allowed the magic of canning, using heat and water and an airtight seal, to come home. And that is how putting stuff in a glass jar or bottle came to be called canning, because it was the way you could do the same thing as canning, but at home. So now I say that jars became more affordable and more widely available. How? It was the development of easily duplicated and easily reused metal molds. Blowing glass into molds did exist in the 18th century, but as metal was harder to make and fashion and the molds themselves were rare, simple, and few, it meant that any given glass shop would only have a few, and the molds were focused on decorative features rather than any particular precision or practical features. But with the mechanization of making metal, the making of molds was not far behind. Being a glass blower was still a skilled profession. It's just that any single glass blower could make many more objects if each object could be made by blowing the glass into one of many identical molds. However, once glass is blown into a shape, it needs to cool slowly. And what's most important, it has to cool evenly. If a piece of shaped glass is left to cool out in the air, different parts are going to cool down at different rates. And the part sitting on the surface is going to lose heat faster than the parts touching the air. The outside of the object will cool faster than the inside, and the thicker parts will cool slower than the thinner parts. There's no surprises here. But the problem is that as the glass cools, it contracts. And if the density of two regions of a glass object are too far apart, the glass can crack and even shatter. Now, if you've ever gotten a hot piece of glass suddenly cold, often by putting it in water, or if you poured hot coffee into a glass full of ice, you may have seen this happen. In order to prevent this occurrence in these nifty metal molds full of some blown glass object, they had to be placed into a hot space that would be cooled down gradually in a way that would let all the parts of the glass objects inside move from one temperature to another all together, which meant it had to happen slowly so the objects annealed. That is, they solidified all the way down the temperature scale at the same speed. So you had an annealing oven or room. But production glass blowers worked in a rhythm. They didn't have time to blow a jar, jump up, run it to the annealing room, come back, start over. Instead, that's where the child labor comes in. These glass boys were used to run the finished jars to the annealing room. And as you might imagine, this was not a generally safe occupation for small children. And because one glass blower usually needed the help of several glass boys, it was clear that few of these glass boys would ever be trained to one day become skilled glass blowers themselves. It turns out that most of the kids who did get training were actually children or relatives of the glass blowers. And these glass blowers' children who were getting the training were not generally subject to the health-damaging runs between the hot areas to the cold areas to the hot areas and back. Large numbers of the runners suffered from pneumonia-like complaints as they regularly moved from hot areas, the glass blowing in the annealing rooms, through the colder parts of the shop. And beyond the respiratory stress of the rapid, frequent, and extreme temperature changes, they were also subject to the smoke and gases associated with stoking the glass furnaces. And if respiratory distress didn't get them, handling the metal molds full of hot glass and stacking them in rooms full of other hot metal containers contained plenty of its own dangers. Many of these glass boys were regularly taken from orphan asylums set up in cities to deal with the orphans created by farm accidents, early industrial accidents, and of course the recent wars America had just been in. If you're curious about other early American attitudes about orphan employment in domestic situations, head back to episode 41, where I discuss the multiple sources of early domestic labor. The result for the American consumer was that glass had transformed from a luxury to a practical household item, the one to be saved and heavily reused. And it would remain that way to a certain extent well into the last quarter of the 20th century, which does help explain why any home inhabited by a person over about 50 is likely to have a stash of cleaned glass jars saved from purchased products, just in case. Anyway, glass was no longer such a prestige decorative object. It was practical. The knowledge of potting and jarring from the previous century was transferable here. 18th century cookbooks were full of ways to preserve fruits in strong sugar syrups. And now, here in the first half of the 19th century, many a housewife had access to relatively affordable glass jars, relatively affordable Caribbean sugar, plenty of wood for fuel, a new flat-topped iron stove, and suddenly she can start to save that glut of summer produce and bring it out in the dark days of winter. This causes a revolution in local food, but it also turns surplus fruits and such from a chore into an additional source of income. In the past, berries and other wild fruits had been regarded as largely valueless. Anyone could just go pick them, but they largely had to be all eaten up while they were ripe. Now, with means to preserve them, they are an object, like butter, eggs, or ham, or whiskey, that are available for sale and trade. The canning jar not only helped stave off winter starvation and menu boredom, it would also start to radically alter home economics. As the idea spread, the increased popularity of home preservation in bottles then created demand for a better canning bottle, which is where our man, John Landis Mason, finally enters the scene. Born in 1832 and trained as a tinsmith in New Jersey, Mason was aware of all of these developments in glass and canning and was witness to the mechanization and increasing mass production of canned foods and glass jars. At this point, the jars used for food preservation were sealed in a variety of ways, but the general plan was some sort of airtight plug that would be stuck to the neck of the jar with a sticky airtight seal, which could later be broken without damaging the glass. Combinations of cork and clay and beeswax and rosin were the earliest plugs, but these were subject to degradation and breakage. This would allow the food to spoil or fall in when the food was open. As the tin industry expanded with the coating of steel cans, tin and later zinc lids for canning jars were developed. These would be stuck to the jar necks with a seal of beeswax. Paraffin wax, a byproduct of coal and oil production, would be developed in 1830 and soon became indispensable in home food preservation. The wax seal sticking a metal lid to the top of a jar was a bit of a tricky business, and over time jars were developed that had a channel in the neck that the liquid wax could be poured into, simplifying the operation. But pressure changes as the jars cooled or jostled during storage always left these wax-sealed jars vulnerable. Further, food contact with metal lids could also lead to the food spoiling. So the search was on for a better storage jar. Mason's access to the metal world meant he could develop a mold for blowing glass into. And the fact that glass making and metal manufacturer were closely tied because of all that heat meant that as a tinsmith, he had access to the glass manufacturing world as well. But Mason's real moment of genius was to bring screws into the mix. So a quick side trip, stay with me. At the end of the 18th century, there were two competing approaches working on how to mechanically mass produce a metal screw. Screws as mechanical devices had been around since antiquity, but it's generally agreed that the screw is the last of the simple machines to be put into wide use. Now the other simple machines are the lever, the inclined plane and the wedge, the wheel and the axle, the pulley, and finally the screw. The principle of Archimedes' screw to lift water is an idea that surfaced on and off through the ages. In the Mediterranean, the screw was mostly used in presses for olive oil and wine, and it would appear in places like on stringed musical instruments as a method for adjusting the strings, as a method for cocking crossbows, for sealing the breeches on cannon and early firearms. But its use as a fastener for construction would not come for a pretty long time. However, just as molds for blowing glass jars, gears, and rolled metal were all developing at the end of the 18th and 19th century because making metal had been given the boost by water power, the idea of mass producing screws and not just nails as metal fasteners was developed. Unlike nails, which were a brute force production object, screws needed to be cut with precision. The first American screw factory went into production in 1821, using developments in wire making, lathe tools, and more sophisticated gears developed in England in the previous century. It went out of business for a variety of reasons, but the idea of using screws as fasteners was the new mechanical hotness, and starting in 1836, a different screw model came onto the scene. Mason had to be looking on all of this in fascination. And his first patented mason jar in 1858 had a screw fitting molded into the glass neck. He also had a chuck or carving device to make forms that would create the metal caps that had a matching threading to screw on to these threaded jars. That's right, the revolution was the meeting of metal and glass in the age of the machine-made threaded screw. And that is how we got to screw lids on to glass jars. Sure, they were a bit of an investment, but they did a more dependable job of keeping the home canned food good because the seal was just that much easier to get right. And because the lid and its revolutionary rubber seal could be placed on the jar while it was still quite hot, a better seal would form. The practice of submerging the jars with the lids on them, the way modern bottling works, that would develop later when heat-stable materials were developed. At this point, the sealing waxes in the rubber seals in use would go all gooey and melty at boiling water temperatures. Now Mason, like Nicolas Appert, was more of an idea man than a businessman. He did patent the jar and the metal mold design, but he didn't patent his lid design, and he did not successfully extend his jar patent. So by 1880, a later season of the show, the Ball brothers will get in on the game, and the great home food bottling revolution would truly be on. But back here, in the first part of the 19th century, it's mainly the well-to-do who pick up the home bottling craze. And realistically, it's only people in the New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania areas that can even get mason jars. But with the spread of the fruit jar, the preserves bottle, the canning jar, the diet of the American, especially the American in winter and early spring, even without home refrigeration or freezing, was altered in ways unimaginable to the first arrivals in the 1600s, or even to the smoked meat, dehydrated apple and pickled vegetable eaters, and beer and cider drinkers of the 1700s. With the rise of home processing of canned food, there would be spikes in botulism cases, mainly in home canned meat products, which are either low acid or even slightly basic. As home pressure canning, generally necessary for making meat processing safe, it just wasn't possible. As a result, most home preservation of meat would continue to lean towards the smoking, the drying, the brining, and the pickling. Meat in bottles in American food would be rare, though meat, especially seafood in cans, would become popular. So here we are, in the turbulent 19th century, before it even gets to its most turbulent. The whole view of how you keep your food for winter and early spring has just changed. And you have larger factories because of windows. You have better jars because metal and now glass are easier to make. So just wait until the spread of the railroads, when it's easier than ever to move those cans and jars around. American food and the economics of it all is about to be radically changed. But unraveling all that, that's later. Next episode, we return to a familiar topic, corn. Some of it's the same, but the rise of mechanization means some things are going to be pretty different. And who eats corn and how they eat it are part of all that. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you are out there. But even better than that are your reviews. Let people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. If you want more food and history in your future, I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, and our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Sure, it's still food, but now it includes fashion and fighting and fraud and a few other Fs, which means that one F is for fun, as opposed to this podcast, which strives to be E for everyone. Right now, we're working our way through some of the historical context, fight scenes, and just all the drama of the stylish miniseries, Shogun. So join us over there on Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.